She got it today.
We were getting ready to, oh, we should be live now.
Great. Well, if everyone can just mute their mics while we get started here. Great. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Decarcerate Louisiana webinar, Grassroots Analysis of the Root Cause of Crime in Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and Shreveport. My name is Daniel Tehan. I'm a member of Decarcerate Louisiana. I use he, him pronouns. And just to give people a brief introduction, Decarcerate Louisiana started in 2014 when people inside and outside the prison system began supporting one another, organizing, and working for change. Decarcerate Louisiana brings together inside and outside organizers to advocate for abolition and social change. And you can follow us on our website, decarceratelouisiana.org, on our social media platforms, which you're presumably watching this webinar on, and elsewhere as well. And so tonight, just to give a brief overview, we're going to be talking about crime from a more holistic perspective than you'll hear in the media. As many people know, we're in the midst of a moment that has sort of recurred many times throughout American history, where rhetoric and both from the media and from politicians around crime is being deployed very politically and very strategically to really reinscribe processes of criminalization, racism, and white supremacy in ways that will just expand the prison system. And so in contrast to what you'll hear in the media, we at Decarcerate Louisiana want to present people with a more holistic sense of political education about where crime comes from, where interpersonal harm comes from, and also what are some of the things that are alternatives to incarceration, to criminalization, to the racist police practices that we see. So tonight we're going to have several speakers addressing different aspects of this. I'm going to just give a quick rundown. We're going to have about 3 to 5 minutes for each speaker. If you have questions throughout, we'll collect them, and if there's time at the end, we'll pose some of the questions to the group. So the first speaker that we're going to have is Curtis Davis, who will be talking about the Slavery Exception Clause and its role in marginalizing and criminalizing and re-enslaving Black people and other people targeted by the state. Then we'll have Victoria Primo talking about the Southern Strategy and its relationship to the tough on crime movement pushed by white racists and segregationists. Then we're going to have Sohail Sene, sorry, Sohail, talking about unsustainable development policies and their role in the criminalization and re-enslavement of Black people. Then we're going to have Mandy Smith talking about the war on drugs and its role in the criminalization and re-enslavement of Black people and other people targeted by the state. Tamara Jackson will be talking about the role that poverty and the ghetto play in these processes that we're discussing. Maria Harmon will be talking about voter suppression and disenfranchisement and their role in mass incarceration, marginalization, and criminalization. We are going to have a message from a co-founder of Decarcerate Louisiana, who's currently incarcerated, read by another member. And then I will give a little discussion about some alternative solutions that we're going to start to talk about, and we'll conclude with a call to action by Paige Ryan. So as you can tell, we have a lot to cover. We're going to try to keep it very tight, very informational. And if you do have questions, please drop them in the chat. But I'll stop talking and I'll let Curtis take over for the first topic. Thank you.
Good evening, Facebook family, international family. I'm Curtis Ray Davis II. I'm the executive director and co-founder of Decarcerate Louisiana. And tonight we want to start our grassroots or our root cause analysis by stating that white supremacy is an actual thing. The United States of America was designed and constructed with the idea of it being a place for and by white people. As our history after the Revolutionary War and the Declaration of Independence moves on, and the moral questions start to come about. I mean, of course, England stopped slavery 100 years before the United States of America. But once the Civil War happened, once we were codified as emancipated people, there was still the question of how white supremacy was to continue to reign, how Black communities and communities of color could continue to be subjugated. So several architects of our Constitution came up with what was called the Slavery Exception Clause. It reads, basically paraphrasing here, that slavery and involuntary servitude are to be abolished in the United States, except for those duly convicted of a crime, right? So the idea was to say, okay, we're gonna get rid of slavery on its face. However, we still want to be able to enslave people. We just need a legal way to go about doing it. So that exception clause led to ingenious ways of criminalizing Black behavior. Like they had laws that were so day to day. If you smiled in a white person's face, you could be arrested for that. If you stood on a corner with more than 2 Black people, they would actually be able to arrest you for that. If you looked a white person directly in the eyes, they had a crime called reckless eyeballing, and you could be arrested for that. Not only could you be arrested, but you were either going to be given a hefty fine, which most people at that time couldn't pay, or you would be returned into a situation that was involuntary servitude. They would be able to incarcerate you on P forms or small work units that they could then use your labor and lease it out to companies and corporations across the South to help them to make sure, first of all, that they regain their agricultural economy for the South, and secondly, to keep Black men particularly in their place, ultimately the whole group. So Decarcerate Louisiana has dedicated most of our time and resources to first educating people throughout the world and Louisiana about the fact that the slavery exception clause is still affecting and marginalizing our communities, and its root cause is in discrimination and racism. A lot of times people don't want to talk about the racial aspect because, post-Obama, we're supposed to be in a post-racial society. But the truth of the matter is that if every person on the planet now decided that we want to love each other and racism is not in my heart and I'm really a good person, that wouldn't matter, because the most effective things that are happening are already codified into law. We call those the roots of institutional racism. So we want to go across, again, our country, and we want to talk and change the hearts and minds of people. That's why we're continuing to do webinars and teach-ins and speak-ins. So I'm going to conclude that basically by saying that if you go to the root, if you want to understand the situation that's going on right now, why are Black men more likely to go to prison than everybody else in the world? Why are our communities so impoverished? Why is our infant mortality rate so high? Why are we leading in every negative social indicator? Then you have to go back to the root, and that root is slavery, which still exists through the slavery exception clause. I'll turn it back over to you, Daniel. Thank you guys for listening tonight, and continue to support Decarcerate Louisiana. Peace.
Thank you so much, Curtis, for that really powerful historical analysis. And I think it is really important that we have the historical framing for everything that we're talking about, because as you'll be hearing again and again, the sort of historical processes, which are political and ideological processes of white supremacy, are still at play in what we're seeing today. So next up, we're going to have Victoria Primo talking about the Southern Strategy, another sort of historical topic and its relationship to the Tough on Crime movement. Victoria.
Hey everyone, my name is Victoria. So I'm going to continue along the line of historical analysis with the Southern Strategy, which is the successful implementation of the Republican plan to appeal to racist white Southern voters to draw them away from the historic Democratic voting bloc. So I think a lot of the time, Republicans love to say, well, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican, and that's just completely disingenuous, because the Republican Party of Abraham Lincoln's day is completely different in its origin. In fact, it started from the dissolution of the Whig Party because they couldn't decide if they were going to support slavery in Western states. And initially, when Abraham Lincoln emerged as a front runner of the Republican Party that emerged from the ashes of the Whig Party, he said he wouldn't touch slavery in states where it already existed. And I don't really need to get into the Civil War. We all know about that. But basically, even after the Union won and we reunified, the Republican Party kind of left the South to be on its own during Reconstruction, which left a huge vacuum for racist white Southerners to become politicians, severely limit the liberties of recently freed Black men and women. And just they were kind of left to their own devices, while the Northern Republicans, who made a lot of money off the Civil War, continued to make money. And then the Republican Party became known as the big business party. So as we know historically, from the 1870s to 1920s, America saw a great economic boom. The Republicans got richer, and then it all crashed in 1929 and the 1930s. So because the Republicans were known as the big business party, naturally Americans resented them, and they began to kind of flock to the Democrats because under FDR, he had his New Deal. Everyone, was getting assistance. However, FDR began to expand the federal government powers incredibly. So under that federal expansion, the Republicans began to kind of take jabs at that as well. So now they're known as the big business party and the anti-expansive federal government party, and by extension, states' rights, which are all echoes we still hear today. I'm going to fast forward a little bit to the 1950s. We all know that's kind of where civil rights really started to take hold. We had Brown versus Board of Education. And with that, a lot of whites across the country, not just in the South, began to kind of respond more to dog whistled and veiled racism, but especially in the South. So instead of political divides for civil rights issues, it became, white Southern Republicans and Southern Democrats were very afraid of Black people getting rights. So there was kind of a great opportunity to seize power, political power, in the fears of the Southern whites, which was historically a Democratic bloc. So then we get to LBJ. He signs in the Civil Rights Act legislation of 1964. He's a Democrat. And he even said to his advisor, he said, I think we just handed the Republican Party, or to the South, to the Republican Party for a long time to come, excuse me. And also at this time, we have Barry Goldwater. He was a Republican politician who actually managed to get 5 states in the solid South to vote for him in the presidential run. And he was one of the first to really emphasize states' rights, what we now know as the silent majority, and arguing against the federal government. And he saw that, the Democrats, traditional Democrats in the South, really responded to that. And this is whenever in the 60s, we really begin to see the parties split to the opposite of what they were before. So moving along with Barry Goldwater's strategy, Nixon and his advisor, Lee Atwater, said, oh, this is a great opportunity to grab these votes. And then they appealed to what they call the silent majority. So appealing to white racist fears instead of actually being outright racist, which we then see with Reagan. And that's, kind of where we are today with the Republican Party, where they are. And yeah, I think that's my time, but thank y'all, and I will pass it along.
Thank you so much, Victoria. And I think, likewise, really important history that I'm sure some people are familiar with in some sense, but just historicizing the processes by which these parties change and where policies come from. We talked about the development of white supremacy, that it takes different forms. I think it is really important to just be able to articulate and render visible where these shifts happen, because, we saw one with the Southern strategy. We've seen different kinds of political realignments, and in a sense, we want there to be more political realignments around, issues of social justice. But I just really appreciate that analysis. And so the next topic, we'll be talking about unsustainable development policies. So I will turn it over to Sohail.
Hi, how is everyone doing? My name is Sohail Sani. I'm the treasurer for Decarcerate Louisiana, and I go by he, him pronouns. I will be talking about unsustainable policies when it comes to the issue of decarceration. Curtis in his first talk did a great job of talking about going further and talking about the root causes, which are racialization, racial coding into our law currently, so that we're talking about systemic problems rather than abstract problems or completely psychological problems. But I would even go a little bit further and use this phrase that's being popularized again and say the root problem right now is racial capitalism. So capitalism, we know, is like a for-profit system based on extracting wealth, and the racial that preludes it includes gender as well. Basically, is stating that the profit extracted is done through racial and genderized lines. So when it comes to unsustainable policy, when we talk about unsustainability, one of the things that comes up is environment. And we know from the for-profit system that we have, it's driving climate change because we need to completely commodify everything in order for large corporations to make, to have the most profit margins. They basically commodify every resource that is possible to commodify. And the brunt of the health impacts falls on racialized communities. It's being coined as a term that's very popularized right now, environmental racism. But further than that, the idea of racial capitalism also has like a historic analysis. So it's not only resources that are being commodified, that are oftentimes extracted through war, predatory free trade agreements, etc., but people are also commodified. And so when it comes to American descendants of slavery and the issue of decarceration today, where they're using slave labor inside of prisons, we see that actual human beings are being commodified as well. Basically, what in this racial capitalist system, you have a for-profit system, and the power structures are divided through difference, through the difference of race and gender. And this creates essentially surplus people. So the very people that control the policies that are being passed that are oftentimes racialized or prevent the work of anti-racist movements from bringing equity into our laws are corporations that are interested in keeping high profit margins, and people that are considered surplus are not a worry for these corporations. So I know that Ilamba wanted me to talk about Section 8 policy and its inadequacy in keeping people housed. Right now, currently, there are 500,000 homeless people inside the United States. The majority, they're disproportionately Black and brown people, and there are about 17 million vacant homes. And the reason for this is because even though we have homes for use, there's a use value. They don't have exchange value. Housing homeless people does not have an exchange value. And so when we're talking about communities that are disproportionately affected by unsustainable environmental policy, when we're talking about them being disproportionately not housed and homeless, when we're talking about them facing a history of being marginalized through the power of difference, we could really see that there needs to be a reorganization of our social relationships and how we produce in order to truly bring equity and truly bring justice. And incarceration is just a method of taking care of the surplus people. That's why they end up in jail. And the last thing I'm going to say, because my time is running out, is incarceration itself is unsustainable. Right now, Louisiana prison system has, about 38,000 inmates. The total cost is $16,000 per inmate, which is $622 million a year, or $622 million dollars a year spent on incarcerating and taking care of these surplus people. If we actually treated them like human beings and gave them human dignity, had a more efficient system to provide, we'd be able to enfranchise people and keep up a sustainable system that takes care of the problems that we're talking about today.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you sort of introducing some of those terms that we could use to think about the way that these systems interact, of talking about racial capitalism and talking about environmental racism. We often talk about the systems that drive incarceration or the systems that drive racism, and it is important to name them and the ways that they're connected, and know that, in many ways, incarceration is, some of the most violent, visible, clear examples of how these policies and practices work, but they're certainly intertwined and imbricated with each other. So I really appreciate that analysis, and I hope we get a chance to talk more about it. So next, we're going to just skip ahead a little bit and have Tamara talk about the role that poverty and the ghetto play in mass marginalization, criminalization, and the re-enslavement of Black people and other groups targeted by the state. Tamara?
Thanks everyone for having me. My apologies, I can't turn my camera on tonight. But one of the things, I'm glad you guys gave me this subject because I'm passionate about it. Let's start off with saying that poverty has been the linkage to the majority of the problems within the US, whether it's incarceration, criminalization, marginalization, and enslavement, the lack of education, mental health resources. Poverty is a common linkage amongst all of the issues that we have here. The US economy has doubled in the last 3 decades. However, poverty rates have pretty much remained consistent, right? So individuals, even though the US economy has changed within the last 3 decades, poverty has remained the same. So those who are disenfranchised and don't have resources continue to not have resources or means to really take care of themselves, to have a quality of life that most of us have. And when we see that, then you see the increase in crime happens, marginalization happens in terms of classism, sexism, all of that stuff have a direct linkage to poverty. So we have people who, yes, do they want a better quality of life? They do. But the system has been designed structurally to keep the poor poor, right? The Biden administration just released a brief as it relates to crime. And one of the things that they talked about was social norms and structural norms. And part of the social norms were poverty, and the structural norms were laws. And we know, like, the laws that we have existing kind of exacerbates the poverty issues that we have, but things are still not changing. So we have conversations about racism and inequality. How true are we to those conversations? Because we have people in place that want to see things change. You have folks such as myself that's on the ground, that's working in the communities, and see that individuals are truly struggling, right? And we expect them to behave in a certain way when they don't have a means to take care of their basic necessities. So when we talk about the increase in juvenile crime and we see our communities are going in a different direction, how much are you invested in actually having equity in your community? How much are you invested when we have the discussions of racism and reaching out to our legislative representatives and those who are in office to have these difficult conversations, right? Most people, what we see as crime, the criminals use as survival, as a means to take care of themselves and their families. So they engage in criminal behavior that is not definitely one that we condone, but for them it's survival. And I see that day in and day out, and we turn a deaf eye and a blind eye to it, a deaf ear, I'm sorry, and a blind eye to a lot of the problems that exist in our communities, and we share our passion, but it has to go beyond the conversations in our circle. It has to go beyond that. The government have to do more for people. We have to give our children a better quality education, right? And even with the criminalization, it's done to minorities, to our Black and brown people. The police are not stopping and jumping out on others, but those who are minorities, right? They go in those urban communities and you expect to see flowers grow, but you haven't given them the resources to plant the seed and fertilize the soil. So what we see is what we invest. When you invest nothing, you get nothing. And it's definitely disheartening as we go day by day. I work with victims of violent crime. And each day that I respond to a homicide and I look at that Black or brown family, And I listen to the media and I listen to my colleagues, but how passionate are we to make the change? Racism is real, it exists. It's definitely a determinant with who's at the table. Even myself, as an African-American woman, some spaces I'm not invited in because of who I am. So, and that's real conversations. So when we're looking at the community, just imagine how hard it is for them to survive and sustain and have a normal quality of life. So it's not easy, but poverty is the common linkage to most of the issues that exist. And for hundreds of years, we've been doing it wrong. At what point will we determine to do it right?
Well, thank you so much, Tamara. And yeah, I really appreciate everything you said. And I think that was actually a great continuation of what Sohail was starting to talk about, because when you talk about racial capitalism and the way that these communities are disinvested in, and just the ways that the whole material realities that you're talking about are structured by these larger processes, it results in exactly what you shared. And so I really appreciate that perspective, and I hope we get a chance to talk more about it. So next we're going to go back to have Mandy Smith talk about the war on drugs, big topic. So Mandy, take it away.
Hey, I'm Mandy Smith. And yeah, it is a big topic. So excuse me if I go over a little bit, but so much information in the way we got to where we are today. So mine, like Daniel said, is on the war on drugs. And beginning with a prison population of just under 200,000 in 1972, which is so hard to believe, we now have a 2.4 million prison population. So the US is home to 5% of the world's population, yet it makes up 25% of the world's prison population. And in this, the Black population in the United States is just 13%. However, the Black prison population and jail population is 40%. And then you look at the white population of the United States, which is 64%, and they only compose 39% of the prison population. So how did so many of our Black population become imprisoned and enslaved? So in June 1971, President Nixon declared a war on drugs and the rule of law and order. Nixon was doing the same thing that was done after the Civil War, criminalizing Black people to continue slavery. As W.E.B. Du Bois described in his book, Black Reconstruction in America, he described the turning point after the Civil War. He said, "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery." So we just heard Curtis talk about the 13th Amendment, Black codes, and convict leasing. So this was all done to continue to enslave Black people after the Civil War. So we saw Black people criminalized after the Civil War to keep them enslaved. And also during the Civil Rights Movement, we saw that Black people were continued to be criminalized. But this was done a different way. It was done by way of the war on drugs, law and order, and the criminal justice system. A top Nixon aide, John Ehrlichman, admitted that the Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. He said, "We knew we could not make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did." So Black people were seen as the enemy, and the civil rights movement was beginning to give Black people freedom. Just as they saw a moment of freedom after the Civil War, so they had to be criminalized by white supremacists such as Nixon. From 1954 to 1968, the civil rights movement fought to end racial segregation in America. It was met with police brutality and scrutiny. This was a systemic backlash perpetrated by Southern enslavers. It started many years before with systematic destruction of Reconstruction, instituting 19 years of Black codes, Ku Klux Klan, and white citizen council violence. 58 years of legal apartheid with nearly 5,000 African Americans lynched, non-unanimous jury conviction in Louisiana, which is known as at most times as the prison capital of the world. And then ever since the Brown versus Board of Education decision, we have been seeing ongoing racial discrimination with intent to marginalize, criminalize, and keep the status of African Americans as close to slavery as possible. This was done by waging a war against poverty and waging a war on drugs in a biased way that downplayed the call of the public for community and reinvestment, such as the Great Society. And as Black unrest occurred, which was due to these factors, inadequately trained police officers and National Guard troops entered affected neighborhoods, often worsening the violence. President Lyndon Johnson constituted the Kerner Commission to identify the genesis of the violent 1967 riots. The Kerner Commission concluded that segregation and poverty have created in the racial ghetto a destructive environment totally unknown to most white Americans. The Kerner Commission also proposed aggressive government spending to provide equal opportunities to African Americans. The backlash for this was immediate. White response to the Kerner Commission helped to lay the foundation for the Law and Order campaign that elected Richard Nixon to the presidency later that year. Instead of considering the full weight of white prejudice, Americans endorsed rhetoric that called for arming police officers like soldiers and cracking down on crime in inner cities. Public concern about illicit drug use grew throughout the 1980s, largely due to media portrayals of people addicted to crack, the smokable form of cocaine. So as Nixon got the public to associate Blacks with heroin and then criminalizing them heavily, now Black people are associated with crack and again criminalized. With messages like, you want to go back to the days of military weakness, caring more about criminals than victims, we can't risk that. That was from George H.W. Bush. And then from George W. Bush, it's always been normal when a child turns into a criminal to say it's our fault, society's fault. Well, under George W. Bush, it's your fault. You're going to get locked up because we aren't going to have any more guilt-ridden thought that says we are somehow responsible. Our society moved away from using scientific reasoning to advance the cause of humanity. Scientific reasoning and the scientific method, like what was used in the Kerner Commission, was ignored. And society went straight out to persecution and enslavement of humanity. At this same time that the war on drugs was being waged, not only was the CIA aware cocaine sold in the US during the 1980s was funding the Nicaraguan Contras, but they were also complicit in its distribution. This was confirmed by the CIA Inspector General. This war on drugs was continued by passing tough on crime laws. These were passed during Reagan, Bush, and Clinton presidencies. We had the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984, which called for mandatory minimum sentencing, abolished federal parole and many rehabilitation programs. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which reinstated the use of the death penalty for war on drugs, increased sentences for low-level drug offenses, and instituted racially discriminatory sentencing disparities between crack and powder cocaine. The 94 crime bill exploded mass incarceration with federal three strikes laws. It expanded the death penalty, allowed children as young as 13 to be tried and imprisoned as adults. Eliminated funding for prison education, required states to spend more money on policing and prisons, and reduce standards of care in federal prisons. The Truth in Sentencing Act encouraged states to pass laws requiring people convicted of violent crimes to serve a minimum of 85% of their sentence before they're eligible for parole. Prison Litigation Reform Act made it harder for people in prison to file lawsuits in federal courts. And the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act. People who were falsely convicted of or who had serious issues in their trial had a harder time getting relief in court. Because of the tough on crime laws and targeting of the Black population, we have the 2.4 million prison population today and the racial disparities that I've discussed earlier. And just a reminder of why this all started, this war on drugs, we can recall the statement by Nixon's top aide. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and the Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and Black people. We knew that we could not make it illegal to be either against the war or Black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and Blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt their communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, and vilify them night after night on the evening news. Did we know they were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. Thank you.
Thanks, Mandy. That was a lot to cover, and I think you did a really good job touching on just really a suite of moments in time where choices were made to further this punishment, this really bipartisan punishment project that is obviously so racist and anti-poor people. So I just really appreciate you making those connections. So next we're going to have Maria talking about voter suppression and disenfranchisement. Maria.
Hi, everyone. I'm Maria Harmon with Decarcerate Louisiana. I'm one of their board chair members, and also I'm a co-director of Step Up Louisiana. And with voter suppression and disenfranchisement, over the last 20 years, we've had states that put barriers in front of the ballot box for people to turn out to vote. The act of voting definitely speaks to the power of democracy, collective power, and how politics plays a part in really determining the laws that govern our society. And this is a big reason why they have put so many barriers in place to keep certain communities disenfranchised, like Black and Brown communities. The Southern strategy definitely benefited the states' rights agenda in keeping certain communities suppressed from voting. Imposing stricter voting ID laws that targets a lot of Black and Brown communities, cutting voting times, also restricting registration and purging voter polls. All of these things are tactics and efforts that really keep voter suppression down. A lot of efforts received a boost, like voter suppression efforts, after the Supreme Court weakened the Voting Rights Act in 2013. And they have kept a significant number of eligible voters from the polls by doing this. This hit all Americans, but the people who were most impacted were Black voters and essentially Latino voters and other voters of color. And whenever you're placing special burdens on racial minorities, poor people, and young and old voters, it really speaks to this dynamic of white supremacy and classism and racism on a systemic level to maintain power and control. And it also speaks to it why voting is so important, and is really essentially a tool that makes our democratic society work. And the Shelby County v. Holder versus Holder decision really set the tone for a lot of voter suppression tactics that took place in a lot of states. In many states, they were hit the hardest with voter suppression tactics. Right after that decision was made was Texas, Georgia, Louisiana for sure, among other states like Arizona as well. And what that decision did is stripped the Supreme Court ruling in 2013, it stripped the Federal Voting Rights Act of the pre-clearance requirement. And what the pre-clearance did on the federal law, where whenever a certain state wanted to tweak or adjust or amend their voting rights laws according to their own state constitution, they actually had to get pre-clearance through the federal government for just for the sake of fairness and transparency, and to ensure that we're not disenfranchising voters. But since the Supreme Court went ahead and ruled like this in 2013, it just it was like a resurgence of the Southern strategy all over again, in my honest opinion. And honestly, whenever you remove that, getting the authorization from the federal government to provide protection, what you get is more systems of disenfranchisement that really keeps voter turnout down. It makes people not want to take part in the political system. And that's not really what we want, especially if we're trying to overturn laws like abolishing slavery. And essentially, again, politics is about turning out our people to vote. So not all people are, that are along the history of being, being part of major parties or whatnot, they're not the ones as impacted as Black and brown poor people are when it comes to voter suppression. And in this moment, a lot of Republicans, who the Republican Party, have played a major role in voter suppression in their dynamics of strategy, as far as gerrymandering, redistricting, and which is why taking the census and other things is so important, because we have to make sure we're counted, because all of that determines how our voting districts are going to be set up. Also, Republicans have used dog whistle rhetoric, inciting fear in regards to communities of color. They really lay heavy on the rhetoric like voter fraud, which happens very rare. It rarely happens, but they incite fear to exacerbate a false narrative to push unjust laws. After the Shelby v. Holding decision, an immediate tactic did take place that were employed in many states, like again in Texas and Georgia, Arizona, and Louisiana. The states no longer were subject to preclearance, so closure of polling places took place in predominantly Black and Latino communities. In Louisiana, 2/3 of all parishes had closed polling places. 2/3, that is a lot, leaving voters with 126 fewer places to vote than we did in 2012. So the biggest closure was Jefferson Parish, which is the largest parish in the state. They are made up of 26% African American and 14% Latino. And that parish first shut down 23 voting locations in 2015 for lack of compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act, ADA. And instead of making low-cost modifications or relocating these polling locations in subsequent elections, as far as like your midterm, your local elections, your national, federal elections with voting for president and whatnot, they did not accommodate people to have the adequate amount of voting places. And essentially, whenever you're doing that, you're creating an environment for longer lines where people are just standing in line for hours to turn out to vote. And all of this is just a part of the voter suppression tactic. And also in Louisiana, since the Voting Rights Act, safeguards were removed, 76 closed polling locations happened after the 2014 midterm election. So right now, essentially we have a total of about 126 that were closed, but 2/3 that have been shut down is just a very significant number to really think about. And in Wynn Parish, which is 31% African American, they closed 24% of its polling locations. There's the highest percentage in the state. Lafayette Parish also followed with 17%. And then Jefferson Parish followed with 15%. And then Bienville and Morehouse parishes followed with 14% each. And in East Baton Rouge Parish, which is 46% African American, they closed 10 polling locations since the Shelby decision was made in 2013. And in October of 2016, the parish voted to consolidate 19 polling locations due to historic flooding, which was which happened in 2016, the major floods. So all of these different things happen in a way to shift the dynamics and really keep voter turnout low. Also, with the pandemic happening, that was another opportunity that a lot of conservatives used to try to suppress voter turnout. A lot of people took advantage of voting by mail around that time or submitting their paper ballot through election drop boxes at each of polling locations or at the voter registrar's office. So the local grassroots group, the Power Coalition, they went ahead and they put a petition in place to sue the state of Louisiana, and they actually won the case. Because the Kyle Ardoin, the Secretary of State, he was trying to go do a policy in place to actually not use drop boxes as a valid way for people to submit their vote by mail ballots. And actually that is against the own policy of the Secretary of State's office, because if you go to the Secretary of State website, you can see ways to submit your vote by mail ballot. And it literally says that you can submit it, or you can have a family member by affidavit or handwritten letter by you giving them permission to submit your ballot for them to do it on your behalf. So for him to go ahead and push that initiative was just blatantly wrong. I'm glad that grassroots groups like Power Coalition, who also supports Decarcerate Louisiana's mission as well, that use their resources and capacity to get in the way of a wrongdoing and really stand up for the people. But I'll conclude there because I don't want to take up too much time. I don't know if I went over, but I was just trying to touch on all the points.
No, you were touching on so much, and I really appreciate it. I think, yeah, it's just really useful, I think, also in transitioning from thinking about some of these historical processes to thinking about how those processes show up in the present day, right? Because 2013 just happened, right? And we're talking about battles that are going on right now in terms of what you just described in Louisiana. I think the other thing that's really helpful just for me as I'm thinking about this is pointing us to the ways that it's not just federal policy, right? It's not just the Joe Bidens and the Richard Nixons and the Ehrlichmans who are making these policies. It's happening at the state and local level, whether that's parishes or counties, and also that the resistance to that can happen at the local level, I think is super important. So thank you so much, Maria, for that. So now we're actually going to throw it back to Mandy to read a statement, and Mandy, I'll let you frame it. Go ahead.
So this is a statement from our founder, Ilamba, who is currently being held in bondage in the Louisiana Department of Corrections. At this juncture, right after we had heard about the unjust laws and abusive legal strategies that keep segregation and slavery going in this country, and right before the last two speakers come on to talk about alternative solutions and a call to action, I think it's proper to talk about where we are coming from, our home base. And ours in the Decarcerate Louisiana Freedom Movement is the natural rights philosophy and belief that all human beings are created equal and are endowed by their creator with certain rights that are natural, essential, inherent, and inalienable. Rights that are above the power of government to destroy or deny. What are these rights? Namely, they are enjoying life and liberty, acquiring, possessing, and owning property, pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety, protecting and defending life and liberty. Throughout the history of time, these natural rights have been invoked and relied upon by anti-slavery crusaders and natural rights advocates, seeking in some way to make more secure these natural rights. The Constitution of the United States government is founded on and rests on the same natural rights philosophy and universal belief that all human beings are created equal and that by the grace of God have been given certain rights that cannot be transferred or taken away, such as, for example, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The people in the American colonies saw British rule to be in violation of their natural rights, and they said no taxation without representation, and organized a successful revolution seeking the enjoyment of these natural rights under this American Constitution. Likewise, we the people in the Decarcerate Louisiana Freedom Movement see the slavery exception clause in the Louisiana Constitution, Article 1, Section 3, to be in violation of the natural rights of all human beings who are citizens in the state of Louisiana. More than that, we in the Decarcerate Louisiana Freedom Movement condemn poverty, the ghetto, Nixon's war on drugs policy, voter suppression laws, unsustainable community development policies, and the Republicans' racist Southern strategy. We condemn it because it has had the effect of destroying or otherwise denying to millions of people trapped in the ghetto and prisons in this country the enjoyment of their natural rights and even the right to defend and protect life and liberty. And just like the American revolutionaries and the French revolutionaries, or revolutionaries anywhere who have fought for the betterment and upliftment of humankind by seeking new laws and policy changes designed to make more secure these natural rights, we too in the Decarcerate Louisiana Freedom Movement are seeking the betterment and upliftment of humankind by proposing legislation to abolish or repeal defective laws and policies, and also by adopting or proposing new laws and policies designed to make more secure these natural rights. And that helps society make the transition from good to better and from excellent to great.
Thank you so much, Mandy, and a special thank you to Alamba for sharing that with us. I just want to take a moment and salute Alamba for the work that he does every day in the midst of some of the worst conditions imaginable. We haven't even gotten into the conditions in these prisons, but to carry on this fight and to also provide us with that kind of moral clarity, I think is so admirable and essential in these movements. And so I just I want to take a moment to salute him and send him our support and solidarity. And also to put off me having to talk. So I'll be talking about alternative solutions. So I shouldn't need too long to present all of them. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover all of the solutions, right? We've been talking about manifold processes of criminalization, marginalization, and oppression, right? And our responses have to be equally manifold, right? It's not even just talking about, individual policies, though we will, or individual systems. We are talking about a set of interlocking systems, and we have to, keep that present in our analysis. So the place I actually want to start is just there, right? Is doing this kind of, I think, political and public education is essential, because when people see in the media that there is a so-called spike in crime or a crime wave, it is so easy to be captured by the way that the media wants us to think about interpersonal harm. And it's really important that people realize that this focus on interpersonal harm, on sensational instances of violence, obscures the system's histories and processes that we've been talking about here today. And it takes a lot longer, frankly. We've been talking for an hour now, and we've just barely touched on these issues that undergird everything that you see in the communities that we're talking about in our cities, in our states, right? Both on a political level, on an interpersonal level. And so, when you see it in the media, when you see what's happening right now with the sort of sensationalist wave of reporting about a so-called spike in crime, what it is really doing is obscuring these deeper causes, these roots. And what we're trying to do here is a process of political education, right? To make people more aware, to create resources so that people can just, even just start to learn more on their own, and to hopefully get involved with some of the movements to push back against these processes and systems. So just to talk about a few of them, because I think, where you go next with that is that your analysis of the causes informs your analysis of the solutions, right? And we can talk about the solutions that we've had in the past that have been inadequate. And I think, Alamba wanted me to mention, but I think it's a really important thing to mention is the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment. Because here we have a solution, quote unquote, to the problem of slavery that in fact reinscribed slavery. It reinscribed the very form of racial and social control that it was seeking to abolish, right? And so that is an example of an ineffective and incomplete solution to a real problem. But of course, that is always going to be the kind of solution presented to us by people in power, by white power structures, and by the people who have been perpetrating these systems for time immemorial. And so when we have a deeper understanding of the root causes of crime and of the different problems that we've been talking about here, we have different kinds of solutions. And I think one thing just to talk about is the importance of making programs universal and solutions universal and not having those carve-outs. And so, just to name one, we've mentioned this in passing, but Decarcerate Louisiana in this past legislative session has been pushing a bill to remove the exception clause from the Louisiana state constitution. And so just as in the 13th Amendment, you have this exception clause, slavery shall be prohibited except as punishment of crime. That language was incorporated into state constitutions. And, it has the same effect of allowing states to re-enslave people in prisons and jails. And so to start with, we need to tear out that root of white supremacy and of enslavement. And you see what happens when you try to do that, which is that, on Tuesday, May 11th of this year, 2021, Republican members of the Louisiana House Committee on Civil Law and Procedure voted down House Bill 196, which was a bill that was presented by Decarcerate Louisiana and its legislative allies, that would have prohibited slavery in the state for good, right? And you can see footage of that committee hearing where there are white legislators talking to Decarcerate Louisiana members about how this is perhaps the most dangerous bill they've seen in session, which really is like a shocking moment of honesty about the power that comes with trying to respond in a more holistic way to the problems that we've been talking about. And so I would encourage people to look more into that. But in the interest of time, I also just want to mention a couple of other things, because again, as much as we do need interlocking systemic responses that take on different aspects of racial capitalism, environmental racism, mass incarceration, neo-enslavement, we also need to undo the specific policies that have created these massive bureaucracies of punishment and pain. And so, we need to repeal the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and 1988, the Sentencing Reform Act of 1994, and the 1994 Crime Bill, which included the Truth in Sentencing Act, the PLRA, the Prison Litigation Reform Act, I could talk about that for years, and also the Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996. And I just want to point out that those bills happened under a Democratic administration, right? This is not just a Republican effort, this is a bipartisan effort. Bill Clinton was president and Joe Biden wrote the thing, right? And so when we're in this moment where we have a so-called progressive, well, I don't even know if you would call himself a progressive, but when we have Joe Biden in the White House and we have a so-called crime wave, we need to be especially attentive to the ways that these narratives are coming back out, and we need to be doing the work of pushing back against them, both by repealing these laws and also by implementing alternative solutions. And so I'm over time, so just very quickly, I think it is really important to talk about the fact that we are in a moment where there is an unprecedented amount of attention to different ways of responding to harm that occurs. That includes both interpersonal harm, right, of things that you do see in the news of people, hurting each other, stabbing, killing, beating, sexual assault, like things that are real serious problems that happen interpersonally, but also structural forms of harm, the disinvestment in communities that creates the situations that we've been talking about. The military imperialism overseas that happens both, in hard power and soft power through trade policies, right? Economic harms, right? And so the abolitionist movement and also the restorative justice movement are two really important, and can't get into it now, but really important ideological responses and interventions to the processes that we've been talking about that say, yes, we need to address harm. We need to address harm both at the individual level, thinking about what caused that harm to occur and how it can be repaired interpersonally. We also have to think about it, collectively. We need to think about it societally, and we need to think about it politically. And so, as just a closing note, I will say, to me, what is most important and inspiring in thinking about what our solutions are is that the opposite of these processes of criminalization, which are very individualized, right? They put all of the burden of blame on a single person for something that's actually, an action that might be the result of hundreds of years of history and social, conditioning and all of the things that we've been talking about. And the opposite of that is solidarity and building community and fighting back collectively. And that's what Decarcerate Louisiana is trying to do. And we would invite you to do with us as well. So I went over, I'm sorry, I'm a bad moderator. I will pass it over to Paige, who's going to give a call to action.
Thank you, Daniel. And I just want to say thank you to everyone who took part in this webinar tonight, and for everyone who's going to be watching it. So I do want to start out with actually what Daniel was talking about, with how Representative Edmund Jordan proposed a bill and it was blocked by the Republican state legislature. Alan Seabaugh did say, state representative, that this is the most dangerous bill that the session will see this season, and that it has nothing to do with slavery. As we learned tonight, it has everything to do with slavery, and raising that awareness is really important, because once you get the public to actually believe and understand your cause, then their representatives are going to have to act. So the goal here is to get people to learn, educate, raise awareness about the issue of how slavery and mass incarceration are linked and how they're working still today to oppress communities. We're looking for volunteers of, you can do so many things to help. You can help organize rallies, protests, marches, demonstrations, town hall meetings, press conferences, petition drives, legal actions, rights awareness classes. We need help with social media advocacy. So we're really asking the public to help us out here to join the movement. There's some upcoming events that we have. August 14th, we have a town hall in New Orleans. August 21st, a town hall in Baton Rouge. August 28th, a town hall in Shreveport. The times are to be determined, but if you go to our website, you can sign up to hear about our latest events. You can subscribe. Right on that main page, you just scroll all the way to the bottom and you can enter in your email and stay up to date. You could also contact us and let us know how you might want to get involved with the movement. If you're good with social media, you can let us know, send us a message. And I have this last screen that everyone, if you could take a screenshot of it, if you want to join the movement, please follow us on social media. You can donate to our movement through our GoFundMe page, which is gofundme.com/Decarcerate Louisiana. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube. And so please join the movement, raise awareness, and thank you again to everyone tonight. I just wanted to finish up with that.
Thank you so much, Paige. And I hope people do join. I know we might not have so many people on right now, but hopefully this is a recorded webinar and can continue to exist as a resource for folks. And so, Mandy, do we have any questions that we got over the course of the webinar or no?
Not at this time, Daniel. I don't see any.
Okay, well, I think we can either just close here, or maybe if anybody wanted to offer any kind of closing thoughts, I'm happy to suggest a topic, or if just, people want to reflect. I know we've heard a lot. There's a lot of strands to bring together. If anyone wanted to just reflect in closing on some thoughts, either about, any of the topics that we've been talking about, or something related to crime in communities. Otherwise, we can close out. Okay, well, no need to prolong things further then, I suppose. Should we end the recording and leave it to posterity?
Yeah, thank you, Daniel.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Daniel.
Yeah, I appreciate you. I thought that was super informative. Really grateful and appreciative to all of you.
Great job, Daniel.
Right.